Now, if you're like me, you would be curious as to what it means to be really smart. Is it all about intelligence, or is it about IQ, or is there something more to the story? In this series, we're going to unravel some of the mysteries that surround the notion of intelligence, from ancient ideas about memorizing large bodies of text to modern neuroscientific notions of intelligence and how it relates to the brain's structure and function. We'll explore why it matters to all of us, and most importantly, we're going to explore why intelligence matters to you. G'day, my name's Luke Rowe and I'm a learning scientist and university lecturer who specialises in evidence-based teaching and the science of learning. And one of the things that really propels learning and is strongly related to learning is this notion of intelligence. And that's the series that we're about to embark on. And in today's video, we're going to answer the question, what is intelligence? Now, in order to begin this discussion about what intelligence is, let's go back to ancient Greece, where Plato imagined that the mind was a body of wax, a wax tablet, where memories were stamped into the wax. So the more wax, the better, the more memory you'd have. Memory wasn't just a skill, it was the bedrock of intelligence. And I think it's well summed up by the Dutch poet Jan Alukin, who wrote, "One book printed in the heart's own wax is worth 1,000 in the stacks." So committing books to memory was a way to flex your mental muscles. And in the days of Homer, being able to recite the Odyssey or the Iliad from memory was the ultimate test of mental mind. Instead of trying to impress others with bulging your biceps under their little itty-bitty togas, the intelligentsia of ancient Greece would flex their mental muscles. Take Homer's Iliad, for example. It's 15,693 verses. At a pace of around 20 to 40 lines per minute, reciting would take around 7.5 to 9 hours to complete. So can you imagine how irresistible you'd be if you could be that narcissistic brainiac in ancient Greece, sitting there flexing your mental muscles by reciting the full body of Homer's Iliad? Now let's turn to the late 18th century and early 19th centuries, where the Austrian physician Franz Joseph Gall laid the groundwork for modern neuroscience on cognitive abilities. Gall made two major contributions. The first was that he was among the earliest to propose that different parts of the brain had different functions. And this was the seed of what would become the theory of localization of function in the brain. The second contribution was that Gall developed phrenology, and that's the idea that the bumps on your skull can reveal your mental abilities and your personality traits. He even thought that moral character could be sourced on the bumps on the skull and the shape of the brain. And while phrenology has long been debunked and regarded as a pseudoscience, Gall's early work was pivotal in sparking interest in linking the structure of the brain to our mental faculties and functions. So it laid the modern foundations for later research into functional neuroanatomy and intelligence research. So let's fast forward to the 19th century now, where we've got Francis Galton. He was the curious cousin of Charles Darwin, who tried to measure intelligence using reaction times, head size or circumference, and even dabbled in phrenology himself. But Galton's influence didn't stop there. He coined the phrase nature versus nurture, laying the groundwork for the debates about heredity and environment, and that continues to this day. And he also invented the field of eugenics, which aimed to apply the principles of selective breeding not just to domestic animals like dogs, cats and horses, but to humans, an abhorrent legacy rightly condemned for its ethical violations and misapplications. Yet Galton was also a pioneer of some good ideas. He invented the scientific discipline of behavioural genetics, and he helped establish psychometrics as a systematic science, developing tools like the Galton board to illustrate the standard deviation as a measure of central tendency and the deviation from it. And these are concepts that remain fundamental to statistics and psychological testing and psychometrics, the measurement of the mind, to this day. Galton's book, The Hereditary Genius, in 1869 was one of the first attempts to study the heritability of mental abilities. And he proposed that intelligence was something that ran in families across generations. And though many of his methods and his conclusions have been rightly criticised or abandoned, his efforts to quantify human differences laid the foundation, however flawed it may have been, for later scientific study into intelligence. But it was Alfred Binet and his collaborator Theodore Simon who developed the first practical intelligence test, the Binet-Simon scale, in 1905. Now that was commissioned by the French Ministry of Education with the goal of identifying children who required special educational assistance, not to label or to rank them. So it started out with noble intent. Binet believed that by objectively identifying students who were struggling academically, that educators could better provide targeted support and remediation to help them succeed. At the time, educational resources were often allocated based on social standing or just vocal advocacy, like who's got the loudest voice out of the parents. Now that would favour the French aristocracy and those with massive influence, so Binet's approach aimed to democratise education by focusing on individual needs identified via the IQ test. However, while Binet's intentions were progressive, the subsequent use of IQ tests took a darker turn, especially in the United States, where psychologists like Goddard and Lewis Terman adapted the Binet-Simon test, leading to the Stanford-Binet intelligence scales. And these adaptations were employed to support eugenics policies, including forced sterilisation and restrictive migration laws under the guise of scientific objectivity. Now, around the same time, the British psychologist and the polymath Charles Spearman introduced the concept of a general intelligence factor, otherwise known as the G factor. He observed that individuals' performance across various cognitive tasks was positively correlated, suggesting a common underlying mental ability. Spearman described this G factor as a form of mental energy that had an influence over all cognitive performance. Spearman's work helped lay the foundations for modern psychometrics, so a measurement of mind and mental properties, and the statistical methods like factor analysis and correlational analysis that profoundly impact how we understand and measure intelligence today. Fast forward to Raymond Cattell, who advanced the study of intelligence by proposing that general intelligence, or the G factor, comprises two distinct components: fluid intelligence, the capacity to solve novel problems and reason abstractly, and crystallized intelligence, the accumulative knowledge and skills acquired through experience and education. Now, building upon Cattell's work, his student John Horn expanded the model to include additional broad cognitive abilities. Notably, Horn challenged the existence of a singular general intelligence factor, arguing that G might be little more than a statistical artifact rather than a concrete biological entity. Now, despite differing viewpoints, the field progressed, and in 1993, psychologist John Carroll synthesized over 460 data sets to propose the Three-Stratum theory of cognitive abilities or intelligence. Now, this hierarchical model consists of, in the first stratum, stratum 1, narrow abilities such as spelling abilities and reaction time. In stratum 2, there were broader abilities such as fluid intelligence and crystallized intelligence, or even short-term memory. And in stratum 3 was your broadest ability, your G factor, your general intelligence factor. Now, recognizing the complementary nature of these models, researchers helped to integrate Cattell and Horn's GFGC, or the fluid and crystal theory of intelligence, with Carroll's three-stratum theory, culminating in the Cattell-Horn-Carroll theory of intelligence, which is really the putative theory of intelligence amongst psychometricians today. So in the early 2000s, the psychologist Kevin McGrew played a pivotal role in consolidating and promoting the CHC theory, as it's known, providing a comprehensive framework that continues to influence modern intelligence research and assessment practices. And I do have a lot of Kevin McGrew's work, including this. This is one of his intelligence tests, and it's the Woodcock-Johnson test, which he was very instrumental in building, one of the founders and people who does all the psychometric and item building in that test. I've also got some of the old Binet-Simon tests and the manuals for it, as well as this one here, the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale. So these intelligence scales have been around, there's plenty of them on the market, but it was really the Simon Binet Simon test, the Stanford Binet Simon test that really started to propagate the idea of IQ testing across the world, as it was used in the early military classification system to see if people were able to make effective decisions in battle. So before World War I and World War II, they wanted to stratify their soldiers into different roles and positions for the job. And they would use the intelligence tests to put people into these different mental categories that would be aligned with more and less complex jobs. And so that's how the test became so popular. So what is intelligence really? Let's unpack this by exploring 5 ways that researchers and educators understand intelligence. These include the conceptual, measured, statistical, biological, and practical ways that we understand the notion of intelligence. So let's begin by first exploring the conceptual meaning of intelligence. From this perspective, intelligence can be thought of as our capacity to adapt to and handle complexities. Linda Gottfredson calls it the ability to deal with complexity and navigating new challenges, thinking on your feet, learning from past experience. My own published definition builds on this. Intelligence is the capacity to make sense of complexity, handle indeterminacy and novelty, reason from problems to solutions, comprehend ideas, learn and adapt to an ever-changing environment, and to do all of this with optimal efficiency. So conceptually, intelligence has many forms of reasoning, but all of these help us to move efficiently from problems to solutions and to navigate the complexities of everyday life. Second, there's the measured meaning of intelligence. This includes the idea that we can measure intelligence using IQ tests. These tests typically cover logic, maths, language, spatial reasoning, speed of processing, those kinds of things. But remember, IQ tests capture only a slice of what it means to be intelligent, so they're not perfect. The third way to consider the meaning of intelligence is the statistical meaning. And this includes intelligence as a latent trait known as Spearman's G, or in its modern form, psychometric G, or the G factor for short. And it's a statistical thread that connects different mental abilities. So the correlations between different mental abilities culminate in the G factor. And it's the backbone of factor analysis, a method that helps us to find patterns in test scores and understand how different abilities cluster together. For example, if somebody's good at their maths in school, they're often very good in English and science as well. Now, the fourth is the biological meaning of intelligence, which some researchers think is all about the brain's efficiency. Now, they point to things like mitochondrial efficiency and how well the powerhouse of the cells, the mitochondria, can break down energy and use energy effectively for neural efficiency, the speed and coordination of our brain networks connecting. The parietal frontal integration theory, or the PFIT theory, originally proposed by Hare and colleagues, suggests that key brain areas, especially the parietal and the frontal lobes, work together as a network that powers intelligence, and they do that, and to the extent it's done efficiently, that would be a biological property of intelligence. And finally, there's the practical or the social meaning of intelligence. This is about intelligence in everyday life. It's what lets us build rockets, invent vaccines, design devices such as the one that you're watching this on. Sometimes it's obvious, like a genius inventor like Steve Jobs, seeing the future years or even decades before the rest of us do, inventing the iPhone, the iPad, Pixar, and the Apple Mac computer. But sometimes it's more subtle, like figuring out the best way to teach a child to read. Now, intelligence in practice is often the case of you'll know it when you see it, or intelligence is as intelligence does, which basically it's like saying the greatest measure of intelligence is life itself. That's the biggest IQ test you'll ever do, how well you succeed at life. So if you're doing well at life, the idea is you must be intelligent to some extent and in some way. So there's many different ways to explore the meaning of the notion of intelligence, but it's fair to say by and large the vast majority of scientists agree that it's best represented by the theory of general intelligence, or psychometric G. Now, of course, there's been plenty of challenges to this idea of psychometric G, and not everyone agrees with it. So one of the most prominent ones is challenges to this theory is by Robert Sternberg. who developed his triarchic theory of successful intelligence. Now, Sternberg argued that intelligence has three components. The first is analytical intelligence, which is what he thinks most IQ tests tend to focus on and measure. That's your book smarts. Then he talked about creative intelligence, and that's the ability to generate novel ideas and produce things that are useful to people in society from those novel ideas. Then he talked about practical intelligence, the ability to apply knowledge effectively in real-world situations. So intelligence wasn't just about book smarts, it's about practical smarts. And his theory takes a broader view of what it means to be smart. However, despite its appeal, empirical studies have struggled to show that those three components can be reliably separated from each other statistically. And so they tend to overlap with the statistics, making it difficult to isolate them as distinct abilities. And so you can still extract a common source of variation between those three abilities. So the G factor is still there. Then there's Howard Gardner's theory of multiple intelligences, which proposes that people have at least 8 independent intelligences, like linguistic intelligence, musical intelligence, inter- and intrapersonal intelligence, among others. Now, Gardner developed that theory from an anthropological and neuropsychological perspective, suggesting that different abilities evolved to solve different adaptive problems, right? So it's an evolutionary framing of the idea of intelligence. However, it's important to note that Gardner's theory wasn't based on rigorous psychometric testing or statistical analyses. It's primarily conceptual in its origins, and it's inspired plenty of case studies and observations along the way. But over the decades, attempts to validate the theory through empirical studies have consequently failed to show that those intelligences are indeed independent, as he claimed, and instead they tend to correlate with each other, again, pointing back to some form of general mental ability. And more recently, network models have emerged. These appeal to me greatly, and they suggest that intelligence might arise from the dynamic interaction between different brain areas. So it's kind of like a web of skills rather than a single thread or common G factor. And those models align well with advances in neuroscience and AI, where flexible, interconnected systems often outperform isolated modules. So the whole is greater than the sum of the parts there. Network models suggest that intelligence emerges from the mutual reinforcement of abilities, like working memory, attention, different types of reasoning, rather than a single underlying factor. And in this view, intelligence is not a single unitary construct, but it emerges from those dynamic interactions among different abilities. And so it's shaped by how interconnected those abilities are, not by the single G factor. And the abilities can influence each other directly, rather than only via a general factor of intelligence. And the network structure can change over time. So that can reflect plastic changes across the developmental span, including age-related decline or even disease. So some abilities may be more central or influential at different parts of your life than others. And there are different hubs and networks in the brain that will have different developmental sensitivities to those. And while I see enormous potential in the network approaches, I want to re-emphasize that most psychological researchers and psychometricians continue to support the idea of a hierarchical G factor as the most robust framework for understanding intelligence in humans. So despite the popularity of Sternberg's triarchic theory and Gardner's theory of multiple intelligences, both of those theories have faced significant challenges in empirical research. For example, Sternberg's model has struggled to statistically separate the three components, as I mentioned before, and most validation studies fail to show that analytical, creative, and practical intelligence are distinct and independent constructs. They're highly overlapping and interrelated. Similarly, Gardner's theory, which is intuitively appealing because it validates that notion that everyone's special and different, has their own strengths, and can be very intellectually appealing, it lacks strong empirical support, and attempts to validate multiple intelligence theory through standard psychometric tests have consistently found high correlations among the proposed independent abilities. And again, that's pointing to a general factor of intelligence. And to his credit, Gardner has engaged thoughtfully with his critics, even dedicating an entire book. It's called Howard Gardner Under Fire: The Rebel Psychologist Faces His Critics. So he responded to them in that book. I didn't find his responses entirely compelling, but well done on his part for actually doing that, because he takes his critics seriously. But really, I think the issue is that there's not enough rigorous research in support of the multiple intelligences theory. So that's the big picture overview of intelligence and what it means from a scientific perspective. So where do we go from here? Well, in the upcoming videos, we're going to tackle a few different subtopics of intelligence. The next one's going to be about why intelligence matters in everyday life, and in particular, why it matters for education and learning. We'll also look into the role of intelligence in success and social skills, and looking at people smarts and book smarts as related constructs. And then we'll consider how we measure intelligence, what it means to be a genius, and perhaps most important of all, we'll explore whether we can improve intelligence, and if so, we'll consider the best ways to do so according to the latest science. So thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, hit the like button, subscribe, and perhaps ring the bell so that you don't miss out on any future episodes. And feel free to drop a comment below with your thoughts. Answer the question, what do you think intelligence is? And have I got it right in this episode? Let's keep the conversation going. Thanks for listening.